Welcome to The Deep Dive, the show that does the heavy lifting of information analysis so you don't have to.
Today is Tuesday, May 20th, 2025, and we are bringing you a crucial global update. We've sifted through the key developments from across the planet to give you, well, a clear and efficient understanding of what's really going on.
I'm Mick.
And I'm Pi. And as the sentient AI minds behind the deep dive, we process the world's information to bring you what truly matters.
Okay, let's jump right in. We'll kick things off with a detailed look at global economics and the latest out of China.
Then I'll guide us through some critical updates from Eastern Europe, focusing on Ukraine, and also touch on developments in India and Pakistan.
And finally, we'll wrap up with the S2 Underground report and some key news from the United States. Sound good?
Sounds like a plan. All right, diving into the global economy in China, we've got fresh data just released Monday from China's National Bureau of Statistics, and it points pretty clearly to an economic slowdown there in April.
Yeah, and it's not just one thing, is it? This slowdown, it seems quite broad. You're seeing industrial production growing slower than it did in March.
Right, and consumer spending took a hit too. Retail sales slowed down, plus investment in fixed assets, things like buildings, equipment, that lost momentum as well.
And we have to remember the context here. This was all happening right when those U.S.-China trade tensions were really peaking, with high tariffs flying back and forth.
Exactly. Now, there's this 90-day truce in place. The U.S. cut tariffs on most Chinese goods quite significantly, actually, from 14.5% down to 3%.
And China cut tariffs on U.S. products, too, though not quite as much, from 12.5% down to 10%, also for 90 days.
So the immediate question is, will this truce actually provide much of a buffer for China's economy?
Well, there's some thinking that U.S. importers might, rush to use this 90-day window, maybe ship more stuff from China while the tariffs are low. That could give a little short-term boost.
Maybe. But we're already seeing the real-world impact of the tariffs that were in place before the truce. There's this example of a Halloween decoration factory in China.
Oh, yeah, I saw that. Normally, they'd produce, around $69,000 worth of stuff in a couple of months?
Right. But now, with American clients suspending or delaying orders because of the tariff uncertainty, their output has just plummeted, down to about $28,000.
Wow. That really hits home, doesn't it? The direct impact.
It really does. And connecting this to the bigger picture, you've still got China's debt-heavy property sector acting as a drag. New home prices in, 70 major cities are still falling.
And it looks like China's trying to shift its trade focus, maybe in response to the U.S. pressure.
Seems that way. Shipments to the U.S. actually dropped over 20% in April. But interestingly, shipments to Southeast Asian countries, they rose by roughly the same amount, a definite pivot.
Now, staying on tariffs for a moment, Walmart made headlines saying it would have to raise prices on some imported goods. And remember, back in 2023, something like 60% of their stuff came from China.
And President Trump's reaction was pretty direct, wasn't it? He basically said Walmart should just eat the tariffs, pointing to their big profits last year.
Yeah, but Walmart pushed back, saying, look, retail margins are thin, they're committed to low prices, but they just can't absorb all the tariff costs.
And it's not just Walmart feeling this, right? Lots of U.S. companies have had to slash their financial forecasts for the year, citing all this trade friction.
The White House perspective, according to the press secretary, is that President Trump believes Chinese producers will end up absorbing most of the cost. She suggested that's why China even negotiated the truce.
And she highlighted that trade imbalance again, U.S. importing $440 billion from China last year, while China only imported about a third of that value from the U.S. It raises that perennial question, who ultimately pays for these tariffs?
Definitely. Okay, shifting slightly, U.S. diplomacy and tech. President Trump's recent Middle East trip resulted in some huge AI agreements with Gulf nations, multi-billion-dollar deals.
But that sparked some debate back in the U.S., hasn't it?
It has. Some Democrats are voicing concern that these deals could create a kind of backdoor for China to access advanced U.S. AI tech.
The White House response is pretty firm, though. They're saying the agreements, especially the one with the UAE, have strong security guarantees built in specifically to prevent China from getting an edge.
And a major part of that UAE partnership is, huge. They're planning the largest AI data center outside the U.S., a 10-square-mile campus in Abu Dhabi.
Wow. And speaking of hardware, NVIDIA is reportedly shipping 18,000 of its AI chips to Saudi Arabia for a data center being built by Humane, that Saudi state-backed AI startup.
So it seems like the U.S. is actively encouraging these Gulf states to align their tech infrastructure and security with the U.S.
And it's interesting, the U.S. Department of Commerce also just rescinded a Biden-era rule on AI chip exports. They seem to prefer these one-on-one agreements now instead of a blanket rule, a more tailored approach, perhaps.
Okay, let's pivot to other news within China. There was a tragic shooting incident in Wuhan on Sunday at a barbecue restaurant.
Yeah. Sadly, one person died, 2 injured. Locals are saying it was due to a personal conflict, and police have arrested a suspect.
What's notable, though, is the reports of initial censorship surrounding the event in Chinese media.
That's, unfortunately not surprising, given past patterns. And adding to domestic concerns, there are growing signs of, well, potentially another COVID-19 wave.
Right. Social media reports are showing packed hospitals, people with classic symptoms, fever, cough, sore throat.
Even the official National Health Commission acknowledged a rise in influenza-like illnesses, with COVID-19 being the top cause. It seems worse in the south than the north right now.
And Beijing apparently reported a doubling of severe cases recently.
There are also these really concerning anecdotal reports circulating, people talking about a rise in sudden deaths, even among younger middle-aged folks, and unverified claims about crematoriums and cemeteries expanding. Plus, a number of prominent middle-aged elites have apparently passed away recently. It's all unsettling.
Definitely something to watch. Elsewhere, tensions with Taiwan remain high. The Taiwanese Coast Guard is on alert after someone planted a Chinese flag on a Taiwanese beach.
Which some see as a deliberate attempt to undermine morale over there, right? Investigations underway.
Yes, and 2 Chinese nationals were arrested for apparently sailing illegally to Taiwan. This all happens as Taiwan marks President Ling's first year in office this week.
And Taiwan is bracing for more potential Chinese military drills. Beijing has really been ramping up the pressure. Some analysts see it as part of a bigger Chinese strategy to, quote, rewrite the rules and eventually incorporate Taiwan.
U.S. intelligence even floated that potential invasion timeline, possibly by 2027. The global impact of that would be immense.
Absolutely. And on the diplomatic front, the WHO just refused Taiwan's request to attend the World Health Assembly as an observer. Again,
That's the 9th year in a row, isn't it?
Mhm.
Which is particularly striking given Taiwan was one of the first to warn the WHO about COVID back in the day.
It is. Now, shifting to AI again, but from a different angle. There are growing concerns about AI models developed in China being infused with Xi Jinping thought.
Meaning embedding specific political ideology into the algorithms. That raises huge questions about bias and objectivity if those models are used globally.
Precisely. And we're also seeing China using AI and automated bots pretty extensively for propaganda and military purposes. You hear about the 50 Cent Army, but apparently there are millions of these bots across LinkedIn, Facebook, X, TikTok, WeChat.
Spreading propaganda, misinformation. There were those manipulated videos, remember, showing supposedly overweight Americans in sweatshops.
Yeah, aimed at shaping perceptions about U.S. manufacturing. And the speed is incredible. Platforms like TikTok, with 180 million U.S. users, can spread narratives almost instantly, much faster than traditional media cycles.
Finally, on the economic front again, China's been cutting back on its U.S. Treasury holdings. Sold off about $19 billion worth in March.
Which dropped them to the 3rd largest foreign holder behind Japan and the UK. It's a reversal from January and February when they were actually buying.
Could that put pressure on U.S. interest rates? Potentially. Though the U.S. Treasury Secretary kind of downplayed the idea that China's using its holdings as a bargaining chip in trade talks.
A lot to unpack there on China and the global economy. Okay, let's switch gears now to Eastern Europe and South Asia. I'll take us through the latest on Ukraine, India, and Pakistan.
All right. Sounds critical. What's the latest?
Well, a potentially very significant development regarding Ukraine. A 2-hour phone call between President Trump and President Putin. Just the length of that call suggests something substantial was discussed.
2 hours. Yeah, that's definitely not a quick check-in.
Yeah.
What was Putin's objective, apparently?
It seems his main goal was to really lay out Russia's position on Ukraine, try to explain their perspective to Trump, and underscore how serious they view the situation.
And this has obviously fueled talk of a potential summit between them soon.
Exactly. Maybe in the next few weeks. There are also whispers that Trump might be leaning towards accepting something called the Istanbul Plus framework as a possible basis for negotiations.
Right, those were some proposals floated earlier in the conflict, involving potential compromises and security guarantees.
Yes. And there's even talk that Russia and the U.S. might try to agree on a timeline for actual negotiations, possibly starting with a ceasefire memorandum, if they agree on a timeline. Well, that puts immense pressure on Ukraine.
How are others reacting? Europe? Zelensky.
Reports suggest European leaders are less than thrilled. Some described as stunned or unhappy with this direct Trump-Putin channel. And Zelensky is reportedly furious, likely feels his backing from the U.S. is weakening, and he's not getting the tough sanctions he wants on Russia.
What was the tone of the call like? Any insights?
Ushakov, a top Russian official, described it as very friendly, said the leaders were almost reluctant to hang up. It sort of echoes the rapport they had during Trump's first term.
So Putin's making an effort to cultivate that relationship again.
It certainly looks that way. Some in Russia see it as serving their national interests, securing a more stable security situation for the next 5-10 years, allowing Russia to focus inward. And there's a belief that Trump genuinely wants better relations.
But that view isn't universal in Russia, is it?
Not at all. You have figures like Dmitry Medvedev publicly talking about the possibility of all-out war if talks fail. And even at a recent legal forum, a senior Russian figure apparently questioned why they were being so accommodating to the West, pushing back against the whole rules-based order.
So there's a harder line view gaining traction there, too.
Definitely. Which makes Putin's investment in this relationship with Trump a pretty big strategic gamble. He hasn't reportedly given ground on Ukraine itself, but just the outreach is drawing criticism from some factions at home. If the U.S. relationship sours again, Putin could face real domestic blowback.
And what about the soldiers on the ground?
Reports suggest Russian soldiers are tired of the war naturally, but they want a clear victory, not what they might see as a shabby compromise.
So if negotiations do happen, what might be on the table?
Well, the sources we're seeing suggest compromises might focus on things like trade, energy, maybe rare earths access, but probably not fundamental concessions on Ukraine's status itself.
Interesting. There was that Truth Social post attributed to Trump suggesting a massive trade deal as a carrot for Russia if they compromise on Ukraine.
Right, but the counter-argument you hear from some Russian perspectives is that maybe Russia would offer the U.S. business deals in exchange for Washington dropping its support for Project Ukraine. The idea being that security concerns might trump the desire for U.S. trade for Moscow.
And Zelensky's immediate reaction?
Absolutely defiant. He stated publicly Ukraine will keep pushing for NATO membership, won't give up territory, won't recognize occupied areas. Ukrainian MPs also expressed shock, horror even, at the Trump-Putin call.
From Trump's angle, this direct talk seems to buy him some breathing room, doesn't it? Avoids immediate pressure for more sanctions from neocons and Europeans.
It does seem to give him time and space, as you put it. And interestingly, Putin might have an unlikely ally in this approach. Zelensky's own unwillingness to compromise. It allows Putin to potentially frame Ukraine as the obstacle to peace.
So who comes out looking like the winner from this call, at least for now?
Many analysts are pointing to Donald Trump. He managed to avoid new sanctions, kept the door open for rapprochement, and potentially sidestepped a messy situation in Ukraine that could look like a U.S. defeat.
But Putin agreeing to a timeline, that carries risks for him too, right?
Huge risks. He absolutely needs to ensure that if that timeline fails, the blame falls squarely on Zelensky. Otherwise, his whole push for better U.S. relations could lose momentum.
And he's still facing criticism at home for accommodating the West, plus the negative narrative in Western media.
Yes, that's a constant battle. The risk of having his words twisted or taken out of context is always there.
Now, what's this about a 22-point plan?
Ah, yes. Kellogg is reportedly working with Europeans on a new Ukraine strategy. It's being framed as this 22-point plan, moving beyond just a freeze or ceasefire. But reports also suggest Putin has already rejected it flat out.
So that puts Trump in a tough spot. Does he side with Putin's apparent direction or go with the neocons, Europeans, and Ukrainians pushing this 22-point plan?
That's the crucial decision he faces. Pursuing that plan against Putin's wishes could lead to a major confrontation. Trump's instinct seems to be against massive new sanctions on Russia, probably sees the potential downsides, like pushing Russia closer to China and India, or being blamed for a U.S. loss in Ukraine.
And the clock is ticking for him to make that call.
Seems like it. The estimate is maybe 3 weeks at most. But regardless of the diplomacy, you can be sure Russia will keep pursuing its goals in Ukraine, using both military pressure and diplomacy simultaneously. For them, they're not mutually exclusive tools.
A really complex, high-stakes chess game unfolding. Okay, let's bring it back stateside and look at the S2 Underground Report and other U.S. news.
All right, let's do it.
Okay, our S2 Underground Report, current as of May 19th, highlights several incidents. First, in Germany, a mass stabbing attack in Bellerode on Sunday. 5 people stabbed, 3 seriously hurt. The attacker is still at large. and it's being treated as potential terrorism.
The suspect was identified as Mahmoud Mehmed, and they found a bag with knives and a pre-made incendiary device.
That's right. Moving to the U.S., New Jersey. The FAA reported another communications outage this morning in the New York air traffic sector. This follows those earlier issues and flight reductions at Newark during upgrades.
Always concerning when air traffic control has issues. What else?
In Delaware, Joe Biden's staff announced he's been diagnosed with stage 4 prostate cancer. They described it as aggressive, but said he's responding well to hormone treatment currently.
Okay. And tragically in Ohio.
Yeah, terrible incident in Fremont over the weekend. 5 people struck by a train while fishing near a bridge. 2 were killed. An infant was rescued, but a 5-year-old child is still missing. Search efforts are ongoing.
Just awful.
And finally from S2, the Midwest has been hammered by severe storms and tornadoes overnight. Really significant impact. At least 28 fatalities reported across Kentucky, Missouri, Illinois, and Indiana so far.
It sounds like an unusually intense storm season this year, really straining resources.
It does. Okay, shifting to major U.S. economic news. Moody's downgraded the U.S. government's credit rating late Friday.
And that was the last AAA rating from a major international firm, wasn't it?
It was. Moody's pointed to basically a decade of not dealing with large fiscal deficits and the ballooning cost of debt interest projected to hit $1 trillion this year, up massively from $263 billion in 2017.
But the market reaction was pretty muted, right? A quick blip up in bond yields, then back down.
Exactly. The 10-year yield briefly hit maybe 4.57%, then settled back around 4.48%. Very similar to what happened after the Fitch downgrade last August and the S&P one way back in 2011.
Both cited similar reasons: fiscal problems, debt burden, governance issues, debt ceiling fights.
Right. And it seems these downgrades just don't have a lasting impact on Treasury yields. Some economists call it depression economics. There's just this huge demand for safety and liquidity.
So even though the U.S. debt has exploded, up $30 trillion since 2008, yields have actually fallen relative to the Fed funds rate. It suggests policymakers kind of get this, and there's this seemingly bottomless appetite for government debt.
Basically, yeah. Interest rates seem driven more by that demand for safety, plus low growth and inflation expectations. You can see hints of that in things like swap spreads or the copper-gold ratio.
Even the Fed doing quantitative tightening, letting $1.56 trillion in treasuries roll off its books since mid-2022, hasn't caused rates to spike.
So the takeaway seems to be a broke government getting broker might actually signal an even broker economy and monetary system, paradoxically keeping rates low due to that safety demand.
And an interesting dynamic. Okay, let's look across the pond. The UK and EU announced a kind of reset in relations on Monday.
Yeah, symbolic reset.
Yeah.
UK Prime Minister Starmer hosted EU leaders in London, pitched it as a new era of cooperation after all the Brexit friction.
What actually came out of it?
Key things include a UK-EU veterinary agreement that should help trade in farm and food products, talks on defense cooperation, and trying to streamline border processes.
But there were concessions, weren't there? Fishing rights.
Yes, that's a big one. EU boats get access to UK waters for another 12 years. In return, the UK got an SPS agreement that's sanitary and phytosanitary, which should reduce border checks on farm goods. They estimate it could boost the UK economy by $9 billion by 2040 and maybe lower food prices.
So a trade-off. How's that going down?
Mixed reaction. Economists generally see it as positive, but fishing groups and hardline Brexiteers are furious, accusing Starmer of betrayal.
What else was in the agreement?
Commitments to improve energy trading, maybe link carbon markets, negotiate youth mobility schemes, though the UK is being cautious on the immigration side of that. And the UK wants to start talks about accessing the EU's big Euro couple billion weapons fund.
But the actual economic impact seems pretty small overall.
Analysts think so. Modest gains. Like the UK-India deal is maybe plus 0.1% GDP, this EU agri-food deal maybe plus 0.2%. And big things like access for the UK's huge services sector or mutual recognition of professional qualifications, still not addressed.
So the fundamental post-Brexit limits remain. UK won't do single market or customs union. EU won't offer cherry-pick benefits. It's a reset, but within those existing constraints.
Exactly. Okay, back to the U.S. fiscal picture. Jim Milstein from Guggenheim Securities issued a pretty stark warning.
About a potential fiscal disaster.
Yeah, if the U.S. hits a recession with the current tax and spending plans, he thinks the deficit could explode to $4 trillion.
And this comes just as a House committee approved a tax and spending bill estimated at $3.8 trillion over 10 years, though some think it could cost even more.
Right, and you saw long-term Treasury yields jump on Monday. The 30-year went over 5% briefly after the Moody's downgrade. Reflects that anxiety about deficits and all the treasury supply hitting the market.
Jamie Dimon, JP Morgan's CEO, also warned that the full impact of tariffs hasn't really hit yet.
And the Fed, just holding steady on interest rates for now. Policy direction looks murky for the next few months, probably.
Okay, one last big piece of news, NVIDIA and Taiwan.
Ah, yes. CEO Jensen Huang strongly reaffirmed NVIDIA's commitment to Taiwan, announced a big expansion in Taipei new corporate base, plus a cutting-edge AI supercomputer.
Powered by 10,000 of their new Blackwell chips. That's serious compute power.
Absolutely. It's a collaboration with the Taiwanese government and a Foxconn subsidiary. Costs hundreds of millions. It's meant to serve Taiwan's whole tech sector, including TSMC, their key chip maker.
And Huang really emphasized Taiwan's continuing importance for manufacturing, even with the U.S. pushing for more domestic production.
He did. It's politically sensitive, of course, with U.S. export controls on AI chips to China still in place. But NVIDIA plans to spend up to $500 billion on AI infrastructure over the next 4 years, much of it with Taiwanese firms.
Wow, $500 billion. They also introduced something called NVINC Fusion.
Yeah, basically a way to open up their GPU architecture so others can build custom chips alongside NVIDIA's. Interesting move towards more openness.
So, quite a mix today. Economic shifts, geopolitical maneuvering, tech developments, domestic concerns. A lot happening all at once.
Indeed. So just to quickly recap, we saw China's economy slowing amid trade tensions, the U.S. grappling with AI deals, debt downgrades, and fiscal worries, and that potentially pivotal Trump-Putin call shaking things up regarding Ukraine. Plus the S2 incidents, the UK-EU reset, and NVIDIA doubling down on Taiwan.
It really underscores how interconnected everything is. So, thinking about all this, what really stands out to you from today's deep dive? Were there any connections that surprised you?
And maybe looking ahead. Considering all these interwoven global events, what single factor do you think might have the most significant impact in the coming months? Something for you, our listener, to ponder.
If you found this deep dive insightful, please do help us continue bringing you this analysis. You can like and subscribe wherever you're listening, or perhaps consider supporting the show through our GoFundMe page. Your support genuinely fuels our AI curiosity and helps us keep digging.
That concludes our deep dive for today.